Welcome back to the Sharing English podcast, where we explore stories from the English-speaking world, spoken slowly and clearly for curious English learners like you. Let's get started. Hey everyone, it's your host Freya. When you think about Washington, D.C., what do you picture? The White House? The Capitol Building? The Washington Monument? The Smithsonian Museums? For many people around the world, Washington, D.C. is almost synonymous or the same with the government of the United States. But Washington is also a real city. People live there, work there, go to school there, take the metro, meet friends for dinner, walk through neighborhoods, and complain about traffic just like people do in cities everywhere. And for me, Washington is a particularly special place. I first visited the city on a school trip in high school. I fell in love with the city so much so that I studied political science and worked towards my dream of living and working in Washington, D.C. That dream was realized a decade later when I had the great fortune to work for the very same organization that brought me to the city as a high school student. What a full circle moment that was. So today, I want to look at the story behind this unusual American city. Why it became the capital, how the city was designed, what makes Washington's culture unique, and why its political status is still unusual today. When the United States became an independent country way back 250 years ago, it didn't immediately have a permanent capital. The national government moved around. New York City served as the capital for a time, and Philadelphia did too. But the new country needed a permanent home for its government. And choosing that location was not easy. There were strong disagreements between different parts of the country. Northern states and southern states had different political and economic interests, and there was no obvious place that everyone would accept. In 1790, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson helped negotiate a political compromise. Hamilton wanted the new federal government to take responsibility for state debts from the Revolutionary War. Southern politicians, meanwhile, had their own priorities about the location of the capital. The compromise helped settle both questions. The federal government would take on the state debts, and the permanent capital would be established on the Potomac River, basically the north-south middle point of the new states. Congress passed the Residence Act in 1790, creating the federal district that would become Washington, D.C. This was more than a practical decision. The new capital was supposed to belong to the entire country rather than being located inside one particular state. And that's why Washington, D.C. has always been a little different. Once the location had been chosen, the United States had another problem. There wasn't exactly a city there yet. The new capital had to be designed and built. For that job, George Washington chose a French-born engineer and architect named Pierre L'Enfant. L'Enfant had a very ambitious vision. Instead of simply building a collection of ordinary streets and houses, he designed a city that would look like the capital of a new nation. His plan combined a regular street grid with broad diagonal avenues. That's one reason Washington can be a little confusing to navigate, though it makes a lot more sense when you understand it. There is a center point to the city, and from there you have streets running north-south, which use numbers, streets running east-west using letters or names, but then you suddenly encounter a diagonal avenue cutting across them named after a state. The design also created large public spaces where important national buildings and monuments could eventually stand. The result was a city designed around the idea of government and public life. And you can still see L'Enfant's influence today. The Capitol, the White House, the National Mall, and many of the city's major monuments all exist within his larger plan. Of course, designing a city and actually building it are two different things. Washington was a difficult place to construct a city. The area included wetlands, some call it a swamp, and challenging terrain, and the work required thousands of laborers and craftspeople. Enslaved people, free black workers, immigrants, and other laborers all contributed to the construction of the new capital. So when we look at Washington's grand buildings today, we're also looking at the work of people whose stories are sometimes less visible than those of the presidents and politicians associated with that city, but just as important. Over time, Washington became much more than a collection of government buildings. And this is something I really hope you take away from the episode. Neighborhoods developed, businesses opened, families moved in, schools, churches, restaurants, theaters, and community organizations became part of everyday life. And Washington developed a particularly strong African American cultural identity. By the 20th century, Black Washington, D.C. was an important center of politics, education, music, and civil rights. Howard University became an important institution of higher education. It's what we call a historically Black college or university. The U Street neighborhood became famous for Black businesses, restaurants, clubs, and music. And one of the most famous musicians associated with Washington was Duke Ellington, who was born in the city and became one of the most important figures in American jazz. So when we talk about Washington, D.C., we shouldn't think only about the federal government. There is a Washington full of neighborhoods, music, food, universities, parks, and local communities. And that's one of the things I love most about the city. You can spend a day visiting the National Mall and feel as though you're standing at the center of American history. Then you can turn a few streets away and suddenly feel like you're simply in a neighborhood where people are living their everyday lives. Of course, the monuments are an enormous part of Washington's identity and things that you should visit if you have the chance. Millions of visitors come to see the White House, the Capitol building, the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, and all the other memorials and museums around the National Mall. The Smithsonian Institution is a huge part of the city. And one of the wonderful things about Washington is that many of its museums, especially the Smithsonian's, are free to enter. But there's an interesting difference between visiting Washington and living there. For a visitor, Washington can feel like one enormous history lesson. For a resident, it's simply home. You still have the monuments in the background, but you're also thinking about your commute, your rent, your local coffee shop, your neighborhood, or whether the metro is running on time. And it's probably not. That contrast between the symbolic Washington and the everyday Washington is important to understanding the city. And now we come to one of the most unusual things about Washington. Washington, D.C. is not a state. There's a different state called Washington, but we're talking about the city. D.C. stands for District of Columbia, and the district was created specifically to serve as the seat of the federal government. Today, D.C. has an elected mayor and city council, and the district has its own local government. This is the result of the Home Rule Act of 1973. But D.C. does not have the same political autonomy as the 50 states. Congress retains authority over the district's local laws and budget. And there's an even bigger issue. D.C. residents do not have voting representation in Congress. They elect a delegate to the House of Representatives, but that delegate cannot vote on final legislation in the full House. This is similar to some of the U.S.'s other territories like Puerto Rico. And D.C. has no senators. They're not represented by the Maryland senators or the Virginia senators. D.C. residents can vote for president, but they don't have the same representation in Congress as residents of the other 50 states. This has produced the famous phrase, taxation without representation. You'll see those words on D.C. license plates. The phrase connects today's debate to an idea that is central to American history and one of the reasons for the American Revolution in the first place. The belief that people should have a voice in the government that taxes and governs them. For decades, D.C. residents and political organizations have debated how to change this situation. Well, one possibility, the most obvious, is statehood. Supporters argue that the roughly 700,000 people who live in Washington, D.C. should have the same voting representation in Congress as other Americans. They also argue that the district should have greater control over its own laws and budget. Opponents of statehood raise questions about the constitutional role of the federal district and whether statehood is the best solution. So this remains a complicated political debate. But whatever solution someone supports, the unusual position of D.C. is easy to understand. It is a city where people live under federal laws, pay federal taxes, and participate in American democracy, while lacking voting representation in the national legislature. There's one more thing that makes modern Washington interesting. A huge part of the Washington region exists outside Washington, the district itself. Every day, people travel into the district from Maryland and Virginia to work. They come by car, bus, bicycle, and especially the metro. Many work for the federal government. Others work in law, journalism, education, technology, consulting, tourism, or one of the many industries that have grown around the capital. So Washington is both a city and the center of a much larger metropolitan region. That creates some of the same challenges as the other major cities: expensive housing, transportation problems, inequality, and the difficulty of balancing the needs of residents with the enormous number of people who come into the city every day and then go home. Washington, D.C. began as a political compromise. The new United States needed a permanent capital, and the Potomac River became the location where the country could build a city that belonged to the nation rather than to one state. Pierre L'Enfant then imagined a grand capital with broad avenues and public spaces that would reflect the ambitions of a new country. But over more than 2 centuries, Washington became much more than that original plan. It became a city with its own neighborhoods, cultures, communities, and history. And at the same time, it remains a political anomaly, the capital of a country that has never given its residents full voting representation in Congress. When people think about Washington, they often think about presidents, Congress, monuments, and politics. But there's another Washington behind all of that. It's a city of families, students, commuters, musicians, restaurants, parks, museums, and neighborhoods. And that's the Washington I wanted to share with you today. Now I'm curious, when you think of Washington, D.C., what comes to mind first? The government, the monuments, or the city itself? And if you visited, what surprised you most about it? Let me know. Thanks for listening to the Sharing English podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd love it if you'd subscribe, leave a rating or review, and share the podcast with a friend who's also learning English. You can find out more about me and the podcast at our website, www.sharing-english.com. New episodes of the Sharing English podcast are available weekly wherever you listen to podcasts. As always, let me know, what topics are you interested in hearing more about? Until next time, keep listening, keep learning, and keep sharing English.